The snow had been falling for days, turning the small town of Ashford, Vermont, into a frozen maze. Streets were buried under thick white drifts, and the wind howled through the skeletal trees like some restless spirit. The town's power had flickered and gone out the previous night, leaving houses in darkness, lit only by candles and the occasional flash of lightning. Most residents had settled in, resigned to the cold and the silence that accompanied it. But for Sam Harper, a volunteer firefighter and local outdoorsman, the storm was far from routine. Sam had been checking on the elderly during the storm, making sure they had enough supplies and that their heaters were functioning. The snow was deep and heavy, and driving was nearly impossible, but Sam had grown up in Ashford. He knew the forests, the back roads, and the hidden paths where no plow would reach. That night, he had one last stop before heading home, a cabin on the outskirts of town belonging to an old woman named Ruth. She was frail, and the storm had cut her off completely. The drive was treacherous. Snow scraped against the car windshield, and visibility was nearly zero. Sam gripped the wheel, navigating by memory, relying on the faint glow of his headlights. When he finally arrived at Ruth's cabin, the place looked as isolated as ever. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney, though no one answered his knock. He tried the door. It was unlocked. Inside, the cabin was dark, the only light coming from the dim fire in the hearth. Ruth wasn't there. Sam called out, his voice echoing off the wooden walls, but only the wind responded. He checked the rest of the cabin. The kitchen was untouched, the bedroom empty. Then he noticed something strange. The snow outside was trampled, leading away from the cabin into the forest. At first, he thought Ruth had ventured out, maybe to gather firewood, but the tracks were odd. They were too wide, uneven, almost like something with claws or webbed feet. Sam shivered despite his heavy coat. He had lived near these woods his entire life and had never seen tracks like this. Compelled by a mix of fear and duty, he followed the trail. The wind seemed to intensify, howling through the pines, carrying a faint, guttural sound. He couldn't place it at first, like distant screaming or maybe someone groaning in pain. Sam quickened his pace, crunching through the deep snow. As he moved deeper into the forest, the tracks grew larger, and then he saw it. A hulking figure crouched behind a tree, watching him. It was humanoid in shape, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its shoulders hunched. Its skin or fur was pale, almost ghostly, blending into the snow. Its head was too large, with eyes that glimmered faintly green in the fading light. Sam froze, his breath catching in his throat. The thing didn't move at first, just watched. Then it made a sound, a low, throaty growl that seemed to vibrate the air itself. Sam ran, his boots slipping in the snow, branches whipping his face. He didn't stop until he reached a clearing he recognized, a frozen pond near the center of the forest. And there it was again, standing on the ice like a sentinel. He could see its elongated limbs and its predatory gaze. Sam's mind raced. He had read about wolves, bears, even deer acting strangely in deep snow, but this wasn't natural. The thing tilted its head, and Sam swore it grinned, exposing jagged teeth. He ran back toward the cabin, but the forest seemed to change around him. Paths he knew were gone, replaced by trees that weren't there moments before. Every time he glanced back, the creature was closer, gliding over the snow silently, with a speed no human could match. Sam tripped over a fallen branch and slid down a hill, snow filling his eyes. When he scrambled up, it was gone, but the growl lingered, now from all directions. By the time he made it back to Ruth's cabin, night had fallen completely. He barricaded the door, piling furniture against it, and huddled by the fire. The wind outside sounded different now, almost like voices calling his name, whispering in tones too low to understand. Fear gnawed at him, but he couldn't leave. The snowstorm was still raging, and there was no way he could escape without being caught. Around midnight, the cabin shook violently. Sam grabbed a flashlight and shone it at the door. Shadows flitted across the walls, stretching unnaturally, then vanished. Then came scratching, long, deliberate scratches at the door and windows. The thing was outside, testing him, studying him. Sam wanted to scream, but knew it would draw attention. He could hear its breathing now, low, wet, deliberate. It wasn't human, wasn't animal. It was something else entirely, something ancient and hungry. Hours passed. The wind died down just enough for Sam to see snowdrifts piling up against the cabin walls. He kept the fire going, shaking, staring at the door. Just before dawn, the scratching stopped. Silence filled the cabin, so complete it was almost suffocating. Sam waited, too terrified to move. Eventually, exhaustion took him and he fell into a fitful sleep in the corner, the fire dwindling to embers. When he woke, the cabin was empty. Ruth had returned, alive, sitting at her kitchen table, knitting as if nothing had happened. "Sam," she said, looking up, "you're here early. Did you sleep well?" He stared at her, confused and terrified. Where was it?" he stammered. "The thing outside last night, it was huge, watching me." Ruth's expression didn't change. She shook her head slowly. "There's nothing out there, Sam. Just snow and trees. You've been overexerting yourself. The storm plays tricks on the mind, you know that." But Sam knew what he had seen. He could feel it, lingering just beyond the cabin walls. The tracks outside were gone, but the memories were etched into his mind. That day, he left the forest behind, drove through the snow with a trembling grip, and didn't look back. Weeks later, news came of hikers missing in the northern Vermont forests. Search parties found footprints that led into the woods but never came out. Witnesses described seeing figures moving unnaturally fast through the trees, pale shapes that seemed almost to vanish into the snow. Sam stayed home that winter, avoiding the forests entirely, but the memory haunted him. Every winter wind that rattled his windows sounded like that guttural growl. Every snowfall reminded him of the creature crouched behind a tree, waiting, watching. Years passed, and Sam rarely spoke of that night. He kept it to himself, knowing people would dismiss it as fear or exhaustion, but he never forgot. One December evening, a heavy snowfall returned to Ashford, and the wind carried the same guttural growl he had heard so long ago. He stared out the window, heart hammering, and for a moment he thought he saw two green eyes glowing in the darkness, just beyond the edge of the tree line. Story the end. The first snow of December came early that year, settling thick and heavy over the small town of Brenton, Montana. The kind of snow that muffled sound and made the forest surrounding the town seem endless, silent, and dark. Rachel Myers had lived in Brenton all her life. She knew every road, every shortcut, every familiar landmark. But the snowstorm that rolled in that week felt different. It wasn't just the weather. It was the way it seemed to swallow the town whole, leaving only whispers and shadows in its wake. Rachel worked at the local diner, a small place on Main Street called Joe's Grill. That night, the storm had started with a quiet drizzle of flakes. But by evening, it had turned into a blizzard, the wind howling like a living thing across the frozen streets. The diner had emptied early, with the last few patrons fleeing for home, fearing the roads. Rachel was locking the back door when she heard it. A scratching, soft at first, coming from the alley beside the building. She froze, listening. The snowstorm masked most sounds, yet this was distinct, slow, deliberate scratching like claws against metal. Thinking it was just a stray animal, she went to investigate, pulling her jacket tightly around her. The alley was dark and narrow, lined with dumpsters and frozen garbage. The snow had piled high, muffling her footsteps, leaving her with that hollow, floating feeling that made the world feel unreal. There was nothing at first. Then she saw footprints in the snow, human footprints, barely visible, but they led toward the forest behind the diner. What struck her as strange was that they were wet and dark, as if the person had been bleeding, though the snow had already started to cover them. A cold shiver ran down her spine. She called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" Her voice was swallowed immediately by the wind. No answer. The footprints vanished into the woods. She wanted to go back inside, but curiosity gripped her. Something in the snow felt off, unearthly. She had heard stories of people getting lost in the forest during storms, never returning. Her father had always warned her, but Rachel couldn't shake the feeling she needed to know what had made those prints. She grabbed a flashlight from the back of the diner and stepped into the snow, following the trail. Each step sank ankle deep into the cold powder. The trees loomed above her, black and skeletal against the gray sky. Her breath came in visible puffs, and the storm seemed to whisper, carrying the faintest sounds of movement just beyond the edge of the light. Then she heard it. A voice. Low, hoarse, barely human. "Help me." Rachel froze. Her heart pounded. The voice came from deeper in the woods. She couldn't tell if it was male or female, alive or something else. She shone the flashlight through the trees. catching glimpses of movement, shadows that darted behind the trunks. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, but she couldn't. Something had her trapped in that moment, a pull she couldn't explain. She followed the sound until she came to a clearing. The snow here was deeper, untouched except for a single set of footprints that ended abruptly at the base of a large pine. She looked around, but there was no one in sight, only silence, and the storm, relentless, pressing down on everything. Then she saw it, a small figure huddled in the snow. At first she thought it was a child, frozen and shivering, but as she approached, the figure lifted its head. It was not human. Its face was pale, stretched unnatural, eyes wide and dark, reflecting the beam of her flashlight. Its mouth moved, whispering words she couldn't understand, a sound like scraping metal against bone. Rachel stumbled backward, tripping over the roots of the tree, back her flashlight skittering across the snow and going out. Darkness swallowed her. The wind seemed to die for a moment, leaving a silence so thick she could hear her own heartbeat. Then the forest shifted. Shapes moved between the trees. Dozens of them. Thin, elongated figures hunched, their eyes glowing faintly in the shadows. They didn't run. They didn't walk. They hovered, sliding across the snow toward her. Rachel scrambled to her feet, her mind screaming. She turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping her face, snow blinding her. The voices followed, whispering, laughing, a chorus of something inhuman. She didn't stop until she broke through the tree line and saw the diner in the distance. The light from the sign flickered, weak against the storm. She collapsed at the door, banging and shouting until Joe, the owner, opened it. He stared at her, confused and alarmed, as she gasped for air, her hands covered in frost. "There's something in the forest," she stammered. "They were following me." Joe looked at her, skeptical, but saw the panic in her eyes. "Rachel, it's just the storm. You're shaking from the cold," he said. But when he glanced toward the woods, something caught his attention. The snow was not untouched. There were footprints, dozens of them, circling the diner as if something had been waiting for her to return. The power flickered, then went out. Rachel and Joe sat in the dark, listening as the wind shrieked outside. From the alley, she heard it again. The scratching, now louder, more urgent. Shadows moved in the corners of the building, long and unnatural. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out. Then the front door rattled violently, as if someone or something was trying to get in. Joe went to check, but Rachel grabbed his arm. "Don't!" she cried. The door slammed open on its own, and a cold wind tore through the diner, extinguishing the lanterns and throwing the room into pitch black. She could feel them then, just beyond the threshold. Eyes, dozens of them, peering in from the snowstorm. Faces, pale and twisted, pressed against the glass, staring, waiting. The whispering was inside her head now, urgent and incoherent, 1,000 voices all speaking at once. Then it stopped. The storm abated as quickly as it had come, leaving an eerie, unnatural calm. Rachel's flashlight flickered back on, and the figures outside were gone. The snow-covered ground was empty. Joe shook his head. "There's nothing out there," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Rachel knew better. She could feel the emptiness left behind, like a mark. Something had been there, and it hadn't left entirely. She didn't sleep that night. She stayed at the diner, staring at the snow outside, listening for the whispering. Morning came, pale and gray, with the town buried under 2 feet of fresh snow. Everyone ventured out, talking about the storm and how quickly it had come. But Rachel noticed something odd. Footprints that didn't belong to any living person, leading from the woods to the diner, then disappearing into the forest again. Over the following weeks, Rachel tried to return to normal life, but she never shook the feeling of being watched. Shadows lingered in corners, whispers followed her in empty streets, and on snowy nights, she could see shapes in the forest back just beyond the reach of the light. Friends noticed her growing anxiety, her fear of the woods, but she couldn't explain it. How could she? The things she had seen weren't human, and the forest had claimed them in some way she couldn't understand. One evening, weeks later, she was driving home from her shift at the diner. The roads were slick with ice, and snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky. She passed the edge of the forest, the headlights illuminating the dark trees. For a moment, she thought she saw movement. Figures hunched and pale, standing among the pines. She blinked, and they were gone. But then she saw them again, Closer now, just at the tree line. Watching. Waiting. Rachel floored the gas pedal, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. She didn't look back. But even as she drove through the night, past frozen fields and abandoned farmhouses, she could feel the eyes following her. Every storm since, every deep snowfall, brought back the memory, the whispering, the pale faces, the shapes that slid between the trees. And she knew, deep down, that the forest never forgets, and it never lets go. Years later, when she finally left Brenton, the forest still haunted her dreams. She could hear the whispers in the snow, see the shadows in the corners of her vision. She never spoke of what she saw that night, not to anyone who wouldn't call her insane. But she knew the truth. Winter had a way of hiding things, of keeping secrets, and the forest was full of them, waiting patiently under the snow. And every December, when the first snow fell thick and heavy over Brenton, she remembered. She could feel them out there, still watching, still waiting for the next person to wander too far, too close into the forest. Story the end. The first snow of December had fallen hard that year, blanketing the small town of Harrow's Ridge, New Hampshire, in a layer of soft, suffocating white. It wasn't unusual for storms to arrive early in the month, but this one carried with it a kind of biting ferocity that made even the hardiest residents retreat indoors. The wind tore through the streets, rattling windows and bending tree branches almost to breaking. Most people stayed home that night, but not Tom Brennan. Tom was the caretaker of the town's historical cemetery, a sprawling patch of land on the outskirts of Harrow's Ridge, dotted with weathered tombstones and skeletal trees. He had promised himself he'd finish clearing the snow from the main paths before it got too late, mostly because the town had visitors planned for the annual Christmas Memorial Tour, a tradition, he insisted, that he had grown to loathe. He bundled up in layers of wool, a thick coat, and his grandfather's old leather gloves, ignoring the creeping cold that seemed to gnaw at the edges of his face. By the time he arrived at the cemetery, the wind had grown vicious. Snow whipped across the tombstones, turning the narrow paths into treacherous ice sheets. The moon occasionally peeked from behind the thick clouds, casting eerie shadows that twisted across the gravestones. Tom set to work with his shovel, his breath forming small clouds in the freezing air. About an hour in, he noticed something odd. A light, a faint, flickering glow, appeared at the far edge of the cemetery near the old section where the oldest graves were buried. That part of the cemetery was long abandoned, and nobody had walked there in decades. Tom frowned. It was far too cold and windy for anyone to be outside without reason, and certainly no lanterns were allowed on the property after dark. Curiosity and unease wrestled in his chest, but he decided to investigate. He trudged through the snow, the wind cutting into his ears and the soles of his boots crunching sharply on frozen ground. As he got closer, the glow became clearer, a soft amber light, almost like candlelight, but there was no structure, no visible person. The source seemed to hover just above the ground, moving slowly along the rows of crumbling tombstones. "Hello?" he called, his voice almost swallowed by the wind. "Is someone there?" There was no response. Just the persistent, flickering glow weaving through the stones as if dancing. Tom's rational mind tried to explain it away. Maybe a reflection, maybe another caretaker's flashlight left behind. But as he drew closer, he realized the light wasn't just flickering randomly. It seemed to respond to his presence, retreating whenever he stepped forward, then stopping when he froze. A shiver ran down his spine, one that had nothing to do with the cold. Something about the way it moved felt intelligent, almost purposeful. He swallowed hard and took another step forward, and suddenly the glow vanished entirely. The cemetery plunged back into the inky darkness, the wind howling like a chorus of voices. Tom turned to leave, the hairs on his neck standing on end. That's when he heard it. Soft, barely audible at first, like the scrape of fingernails on wood, then a whisper, clear and unnervingly human. "Don't leave." He froze. The sound came from directly behind him, though when he spun around there was nothing, just the old tombstones, the snow, and the skeletal branches trembling in the wind. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice cracking. Again, nothing. Just the whisper, faint but insistent, curling around him like smoke. "Don't leave." Panic began to set in. Tom turned to run back toward the gate, but the path seemed unfamiliar. He could have sworn he had been heading in a straight line, yet every direction looked wrong, the tombstones taller, their inscriptions unreadable in the dim moonlight. The cemetery itself felt different, larger, somehow, stretching farther than it should have. He stumbled over something and fell face first into the snow. When he pushed himself up, he saw it, a small wooden coffin, partially buried in the snow, right in the middle of a pathway that hadn't existed before. The lid was slightly ajar, and the amber glow from before seeped out from inside. Tom's heart pounded. Against every instinct, he bent over and peered inside. The coffin was empty. But as he straightened up, a soft, cold hand clamped around his wrist. He yelped, trying to pull away, but the grip was unnervingly strong, like ice. He looked down. There was nothing there. No one. Nothing visible, just the sensation of a hand gripping him with inhuman strength. "Don't leave," the whisper came again, closer this time, as though right beside his ear. Adrenaline surged. Tom yanked his arm free and ran blindly through the snow, crashing into tombstones, slipping, falling, scraping his knees on frozen ground. The wind seemed to howl louder, carrying with it faint echoes of laughter, children, women, men, but twisted, distorted, like something imitating life. He ran until his legs burned, until the path seemed endless. Then suddenly, the snow stopped. The wind ceased. It was eerily calm, and in that unnatural silence, he realized something. The cemetery was empty. No tombstones, no trees, no snow, just a dark expanse, the sky above a black void. And then he saw them. Figures emerging from the darkness, pale and thin, dragging long shadows across the ground. Their eyes were hollow, their mouths stretched in silent screams. They didn't walk, they glided, and they were coming straight for him. Tom tried to scream, but no sound came out. He turned and ran, stumbling over unseen obstacles, the cold creeping into his bones as if the air itself were solidifying around him. He could hear the whispering everywhere now, surrounding him, calling his name, begging him to stay. "Don't leave, don't leave, don't leave." Just when he thought he would be overwhelmed, the sky shifted. A faint light appeared on the horizon, a car's headlights cutting through the dark. Tom ran toward it, screaming with all the strength he had left. When he broke into the road, snow still falling in thick flakes, the headlights came closer and a vehicle stopped. A man leaned out, shouting, "Are you okay? You look frozen." Tom collapsed into the man's arms, sobbing, shaking, unable to speak. The car door opened, and he climbed in, too exhausted to argue. As the heater warmed him, he looked back toward the cemetery. The darkness was gone. The trees, tombstones, snow, they were all exactly as they should be. Nothing out of place. The man drove him home, insisting he rest. And Tom never mentioned the details of what had happened. How could he explain? Nobody would believe him. They'd call him insane or exaggerating or worse. But over the next weeks, Tom noticed something that chilled him more than anything. Each time the wind howled at night, he could hear it. The faint, insistent whisper curling around his window. "Don't leave." He moved towns after that winter, leaving Harrow's Ridge entirely, but no matter where he went, the whisper followed. Sometimes it was in the wind, sometimes in the rustle of trees, sometimes in the quiet moments before sleep. The image of the coffin, the cold hand, the hollow-eyed figures, they never left him. Years later, when he dared drive past Harrow's Ridge during a snowstorm, he saw it again, a faint amber glow in the cemetery, hovering, flickering, waiting. The gate looked the same, but something told him the place beyond had changed, warped into something unnatural, and he knew, without needing to hear it, that it was still whispering to him, still calling him back. "Don't leave." Story, the end. The first heavy snowfall had arrived earlier than usual in northern Minnesota, blanketing the small town of Ely in a suffocating silence, the kind of silence that made the snow-covered forest feel alive, watching, waiting. Most of the residents had already hunkered down, wood stoves roaring, the faint smell of pine and smoke filling the air. But for Jacob and his younger sister Anna, the snow was not just a season. It was an invitation. The siblings had grown up on the outskirts of town, their parents' cabin tucked just beyond the last cluster of houses where the forest grew dense and dark. That morning, Jacob had gone outside to check the traps he had set for rabbits, leaving Anna to finish her breakfast. The air was crisp, biting at his cheeks, and the snow crunched under his boots in a satisfying rhythm. As he moved deeper into the woods, he noticed something strange. a trail of footprints that were too large and too evenly spaced to be from an animal. They were human-like but distorted, elongated, almost as if the snow itself had molded them. Jacob frowned. The snow was fresh, undisturbed except for these prints, which seemed to lead further into the denser forest. He glanced around, feeling the first prickles of unease, and decided to follow them. Anna, finishing her cereal, had no idea that Jacob had gone deeper into the woods. She watched him disappear among the trees, and when he didn't return after half an hour, she began to worry. The sky had darkened, thick clouds blotting out the weak winter sun. The wind began to howl, carrying with it a strange, faint whisper that made Anna's skin crawl. She wrapped herself in a blanket, trying to shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching. Jacob trudged through the forest, following the prints, and soon realized they weren't leading to the nearest road or town. They were leading to an old, abandoned hunting cabin he had passed dozens of times but never entered. The structure was dark and rotting. Its roof caved in, windows shattered. As he approached, a low creaking noise echoed from inside, as if the cabin itself were alive. He hesitated, a cold sweat forming on his brow despite the freezing temperatures. But curiosity got the better of him. Inside, the air was thick and musty, the smell of decay strong. The floorboards groaned under his weight, and the walls were lined with old, rotting furniture. But what caught his attention was the strange markings on the walls, symbols carved deep into the wood, jagged lines and circles that made no sense. They seemed almost alive, pulsing faintly in the dim light. Jacob took a step back, heart pounding. That's when he heard it, a faint scratching coming from the floorboards beneath him. Suddenly, the floor beneath his feet gave way slightly, and he stumbled into a small, hidden crawl space. The air was colder here, unnaturally so, and the smell of wet earth and decay was overpowering. Jacob could barely see, but he noticed something even more unsettling. A small pile of what looked like old tattered clothing, partially buried in the dirt. As he reached out, a voice, hoarse and distant, whispered from the shadows, "Leave before it finds you." Jacob froze, his mind racing. He wasn't alone. The whisper came again, closer this time, and the sound of dragging footsteps echoed around him. He scrambled back, crawling out of the hole, and bolted from the cabin. The forest, once familiar, now felt alien. Every tree seemed twisted, every shadow stretching toward him. The footprints were gone, replaced by deep impressions in the snow that were too wide and uneven to belong to any human. By the time Jacob returned to the cabin, night had fallen. He found Anna huddled by the fireplace, pale and trembling. She clutched a small lantern, its flame flickering violently. "Jacob," she whispered, "I heard voices, calling my name. I thought it was you, but it wasn't." The siblings tried to shake it off as imagination, the effect of isolation in winter. But as they prepared for bed, the first signs of something truly wrong became undeniable. A scratching began at the windows, slow and deliberate. The sound of heavy breathing echoed from the shadows in the room, though no one was there. And then the whispering started. Low, guttural voices coming from the corners of the cabin, repeating their names over and over. Jacob tried to barricade the doors and windows, but the air seemed to grow colder with every passing minute, frost forming on the inside of the glass, as if the cabin itself were freezing from within. Anna clung to him, shivering uncontrollably as the voices grew louder, more insistent. They weren't just whispers anymore, they were commands. "Come to us, join us." Hours passed like this. Every time they tried to sleep, they were awakened by the sound of movement just beyond the walls, scratching and shuffling. The snow outside had stopped, but the forest seemed alive, shadows moving among the trees. Jacob and Anna could hear footsteps crunching in the snow, circling the cabin, but whenever they looked, nothing was there. By morning, the siblings were exhausted, their nerves frayed. They decided to leave, to hike back to town despite the cold. As they stepped outside, they realized the snow had changed overnight. It was covered in footprints, dozens of them, human and non-human, circling the cabin, coming closer with every step they took. Jacob felt a hand brush against his shoulder, icy and solid, though no one was there. They ran, blindly, through the forest. The trees seemed to close in around them, branches scratching their faces and clothes. The whispers followed, now a chorus, chanting their names, laughing and crying. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, Jacob couldn't tell. The sun never rose and the shadows seemed eternal. Eventually, they stumbled onto a frozen river, hoping it would lead them back to town. But the ice groaned under their weight, and the voices seemed to shift, echoing from beneath the frozen surface. Jacob and Anna clung to each other as the ice cracked, a dark shape moving beneath, following them. They ran along the edge, hearts pounding, until finally, exhausted and terrified, they saw the first signs of town lights in the distance. They were safe, or so they thought. But the terror didn't end. When they returned home, they found their cabin in perfect condition, as if no one had ever been there. The fire was lit, breakfast on the table, and all their belongings in place. It was as though the past 24 hours had never happened. Months passed, but the memory of the forest never left them. Jacob and Anna noticed strange occurrences in town. Shadows moving in ways they shouldn't, whispers on the wind, and strange figures standing just at the edge of the forest, watching them. People who ventured too close to the woods sometimes returned hours later, pale, silent, muttering about voices and shadows that followed them home. The siblings eventually moved away, leaving the cabin and the town behind. But even thousands of miles away, the winter carried a reminder. Snow that fell seemed heavier, darker, almost alive. At night, they could sometimes hear it. The faintest whisper of a voice calling their names, dragging through the wind, promising that it had not forgotten them. Every year, in December, Jacob and Anna both felt it, the creeping chill that wasn't from the cold, the feeling of being watched, and the whisper that began softly at first, then louder, closer. Come back, come back. And they knew, with a certainty that made their blood run cold, that one winter day they might not be able to resist. Story, the end. The wind had been howling all day in northern Maine, rattling the windows of the old farmhouse where Sarah Jensen lived with her father. Snow had been falling relentlessly for hours, turning the roads into white rivers, swallowing cars, and cutting off the small town from the outside world. Sarah had spent the morning stacking firewood and checking the generator, a ritual she had learned from years of harsh winters. But today the cold felt different, oppressive, as if it carried a warning with it. Her father, Harold, was upstairs working on his model train collection, humming quietly to himself. Sarah stayed near the kitchen, her back to the window as she chopped vegetables for dinner. It was the middle of December, but the snowstorm had already made travel impossible, and the power flickered intermittently, leaving shadows that danced across the walls like living things. Around 4 p.m., she heard it. A faint scratching at the back door. At first, she told herself it was just the wind or a branch knocked loose, but the sound came again, deliberate and rhythmic. She froze, knife in hand, listening. Her father didn't hear it over the hum of the trains. Taking a deep breath, she stepped toward the door, swinging it open just slightly. The snow was piled high, the wind blowing her hair into her face. There was nothing, only the whiteness, stretching endlessly into the forest behind the farmhouse. She let the door close and bolted it. Shaking, she went back to chopping, telling herself she was imagining things. But the unease stayed, a tight knot in her chest she couldn't shake. A few minutes later, the power went out completely. Darkness enveloped the house, thick and suffocating. She fumbled for the flashlight, its weak beam cutting a small circle of light in the room. Then came the footsteps. Barely audible at first, just outside the kitchen window. She spun toward it. Snow was piled so high she could only see the footprints if she pressed her face close to the glass. The footprints were small and childlike, pressing into the snow in uneven, staggering steps, stopping just at the edge of the porch. There was no one she knew who could have walked through the storm. No one would dare. Her father had always warned her about the dangers of wandering outside in blizzards. She ran upstairs to her father's room, shaking him awake. "Dad, there's someone outside." Harold groaned, rubbing his eyes. "It's just the snow, Sarah. Go back to the kitchen. Help me get some candles. We're fine." "No, you have to see this. Footprints. Someone's out there." He finally got up, grabbing a flashlight, and together they went downstairs. The footprints were gone, completely erased, as if they had never existed. Sarah's hands trembled as she tried to explain, but Harold put a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Storm's playing tricks on you. You're tired, that's all." They ate dinner by candlelight, but the feeling of being watched persisted. The wind outside carried a low, almost human moan, a sound that didn't belong in nature. Around 9 p.m., Sarah was cleaning up when she heard it again. A faint tapping at the windows, like someone knocking. She froze. It wasn't the wind this time. It was slow, deliberate, coming in a rhythm she recognized from her childhood nightmares. Knock, knock, knock. She called out to her father, but he was already in bed, pretending to sleep. Panic rose in her chest. She grabbed the phone to call the sheriff, but the line was dead. The storm had cut all communication. The taps continued, moving along the walls of the house, circling the rooms. Then the shadows came. At first, she thought it was just candlelight, but they moved with intention, creeping along the walls. Shapes like tall, thin figures, their limbs elongated and bending at odd angles, their faces indistinct. One shadow lingered by the kitchen door, and Sarah could swear it was watching her. Her breath came in quick gasps, visible in the cold air inside the house. Suddenly, there was a thump from the attic. Her father had never gone up there in years. The old Jensen farmhouse attic was a place of dust, broken furniture, and cobwebs. The thump came again, louder this time, followed by a dragging sound, like something being pulled across the floorboards. Sarah grabbed a kitchen knife, her only weapon, and crept toward the stairs. She called out her father's name, but the house was empty except for the storm. The attic door creaked open. The beam from her flashlight revealed nothing at first, just old boxes and furniture draped in sheets. But then she saw it. A small pale hand pressed against the far wall, its fingers unnaturally long and thin. It twitched. Her stomach turned, fear rooting her to the spot. The hand disappeared when she blinked, but the dragging sound continued. Sarah ran back downstairs, heart hammering, and slammed the door behind her. The storm outside seemed to intensify, snow beating against the windows like fists. Then she saw it in the kitchen window. A small figure, no taller than 3 feet, with dark, hollow eyes and a mouth stretched in a permanent, silent scream. It didn't move toward her, but it didn't need to. The presence alone filled the room with an icy dread. Her father finally came downstairs, groggy and confused. He saw her trembling, pointing at the window. "Sarah, there's nothing there," he said, but she knew what she had seen. He sighed, thinking she was overtired, but the moment they heard the scraping sound at the back door, even he froze. The back door slowly opened, pushed by an invisible force. Snow poured in and the small figure from the window stepped inside. It moved in jerky, unnatural motions, gliding rather than walking, and its hollow eyes locked onto Sarah. She screamed, backing into the corner. Her father tried to grab a flashlight, but it flickered and went out. Darkness swallowed the room. Sarah felt the cold press against her like a physical thing, freezing her to the spot. The figure raised its head and she could hear a whisper, faint and cracked like ice breaking. "Leave or stay forever." She bolted, grabbing her father's arm, dragging him toward the front door. But the house had changed. The layout was wrong. Walls that had never been there, doors leading to empty rooms. They ran, but the exit seemed farther with every step. The storm outside had stopped suddenly, replaced by a heavy, unnatural silence. Snow no longer fell. The night was still and dark. The figures were everywhere, emerging from the shadows, their faces featureless, bodies elongated. They surrounded the farmhouse, moving with impossible speed. Harold stumbled, and one of the figures reached for him. Sarah screamed, yanking him back. She realized they had to leave together. She grabbed what little supplies she could, flashlight, coat, keys, and shoved her father toward the truck, parked under a heavy blanket of snow. The figures didn't follow. They watched, swaying slightly as if waiting. The engine roared to life with difficulty. They plowed through the snow, headlights cutting through the darkness, and for the first time since the storm began, Sarah felt hope. They reached the highway, nearly hitting another car that had been stranded. The driver, an older man, looked at them in shock. "You came from the Jensen place?" he asked. Sarah nodded, trying to speak, but only tears came. The man shook his head. "You're lucky. No one's come out of that storm alive in years." They made it back to town. Emergency crews searched the farmhouse the next day. The building was intact, but the attic was empty, stripped of every box, every chair, every trace of life. Sarah's neighbors reported seeing figures in the woods during the storm, small pale things moving through the trees, vanishing as soon as anyone approached. Sarah and her father never returned to the farmhouse. They sold the property quietly, moving closer to town, but she never forgot the cold, the whispers, the feeling of being hunted by something that shouldn't exist. Even now, every winter, when the wind howls and the snow piles high, she swears she sees those hollow eyes in the shadows and hears the faint scraping at her windows, reminding her that the storm never really ends. Story the end. The snow had been falling for days, thick and relentless, blanketing the small town of Winhall, Vermont, in a suffocating white silence. Roads disappeared under drifts, and the few locals who remained after Thanksgiving huddled inside, lighting fireplaces and hoping the storm would pass. For most people, it was an inconvenience. For the Winters family, it was a nightmare in slow motion. Mark Winters had grown up in Winhall but had left for Boston years ago, returning only occasionally for holidays. This year, he decided to come back to the family cabin, tucked away in a remote part of the Green Mountains, to spend Christmas with his father, Harold, and younger sister, Emily. The cabin had always felt warm in the memory, a refuge from city life. But the first evening there, with the wind howling outside and the snow piling against the windows, it felt small, suffocating, almost too quiet. On the second night, around midnight, Mark woke to a scratching sound at the front door. At first, he thought it was a branch being whipped by the wind, but the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic. He nudged Emily awake, but she mumbled and rolled over, unwilling to face the storm outside. Mark got up, grabbed a flashlight, and crept toward the door. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the snow-laden porch. Nothing. No footprints, no signs of movement. Just the storm, angry and relentless. The next morning, Mark discovered tracks in the snow, bare footprints leading from the woods to the cabin. He froze. There was no one around for miles, no road access in the storm. The prints were human, unnervingly small, like a child's, but the depth suggested someone heavier. He called the sheriff on the landline, but the storm had knocked out most phone lines. "You'll have to wait it out," the voice on the other end said. "No one's making it out there tonight." By nightfall, the storm intensified. The wind tore at the cabin's wooden walls, making the structure groan and shudder. The family huddled in the living room, trying to ignore the rising panic. That's when they heard it, a soft, almost inaudible whispering outside. Mark pressed his ear to the window. He couldn't make out the words, just the tone. Familiar, yet impossibly wrong, like someone was repeating his own voice back at him. The whispering circled the cabin, moving with impossible speed, then fell silent. The next morning, Harold insisted on checking the perimeter. He dressed in heavy layers and trudged into the snow, leaving Emily and Mark behind. Hours passed, and he didn't return. Mark went looking for him, flashlight in hand, snow crunching under boots. He found Harold's footprints leading into the woods, then abruptly ending at a clearing. The man was nowhere to be seen, only the snow undisturbed, except for one trail that continued in an irregular, almost dancing pattern, deeper into the trees. Mark called Emily, but she was gone from the cabin. Panic gripped him, the whispering from the night before echoing in his mind. Mark followed the tracks into the forest. The wind cut through him like knives, and the snow made it nearly impossible to keep balance. After an hour, he stumbled upon the clearing again and froze. There, pressed into the snow, were two sets of footprints, his father's and Emily's. But something was wrong. The prints were distorted, stretched, and some appeared to be dragging, and around them were dozens of tiny handprints, small, pale, and impossibly human. They led from the forest and encircled the family's tracks, then vanished toward the north, toward a part of the woods locals called Dead Man's Hollow, a place whispered about but never visited after dark. As darkness fell, Mark realized he had no choice. He had to move fast. He grabbed a pair of axes from the cabin and forced his way through the drifts toward the hollow. The trees grew denser, snow clinging to branches like frozen fingers. Every step he took seemed to echo, though the silence of the storm should have swallowed it. Then he saw them, shapes moving just beyond his flashlight's beam, shadows, thin and twisting, darting between the trees. At first he thought it was a trick of the snow and wind, but then one stepped into the light. A small figure, pale, naked, eyes black and unblinking, moving in a jerky, unnatural gait. Mark froze. The figure tilted its head, staring at him, and then vanished into the trees. He ran. The snow seemed to conspire against him, hiding the path, slowing him down. The whispering started again, closer this time, circling, weaving through the trees, repeating his name in a tone both mocking and urgent. Mark, Mark. Hours passed in a haze of snow and fear. He stumbled into a small clearing where the footprints ended, but the snow was churned as if a struggle had taken place. And there, half buried in snow, were the coats of his father and sister. No bodies, just coats, frozen stiff, ripped in places, as though whatever had taken them didn't care for warmth or protection. The whispering intensified, coming from all directions, now a chorus of hundreds of voices, some faintly recognizable as Harold's and Emily's, others alien and guttural. Mark ran blindly, finally collapsing near a frozen stream. He was exhausted, frostbitten, and terrified beyond reason. He thought he saw movement across the ice, a reflection not of himself, but of dozens of pale, naked figures moving just below the surface, reaching up with clawed hands. The figures didn't look human, though they wore features of people he knew. He screamed, but the wind swallowed it. He spent the night crouched by the stream, shivering, barely conscious. When dawn came, the storm had passed. The forest was eerily still. Mark stumbled back to the cabin, hoping against hope. It looked normal, untouched by the storm. But the door swung open easily, and inside he found the living room empty. No signs of struggle, no footprints, nothing to indicate the horror that had unfolded the night before. Mark left Winhall the same day, abandoning the cabin and never returning. He told the sheriff a fragment of what happened, but the official report only noted that the family had disappeared during the storm, leaving no evidence behind. The townspeople whispered about the Winters family, about strange sightings in the woods, about small, pale figures in the snow near Dead Man's Hollow. But no one spoke openly. Superstition and fear kept them silent. Even years later, Mark could never forget. Every winter, when the first snow fell, he remembered the whispering voices, the black eyes in the trees, the tiny handprints in the snow, and the twisted footprints that led into the hollow. He never returned, but he knew, somewhere in those forests, something waited, patient and relentless, for the cold to return, and for him to slip back into its grasp. Story the end. The first time I realized winter could kill, I was 12, and my father had taken me up to the woods outside our small Vermont town. It was January, bitterly cold, with snow piled higher than my waist. Dad wanted to teach me how to ice fish and promised that we'd have the lake to ourselves. I was excited at first. The snow was fresh, crisp, and pure, and the sky was a hard, frozen blue. But by midday, the cold had begun to seep into my bones. I thought I was prepared, layered clothes, boots, gloves, but the wind had a way of finding the smallest gap and freezing whatever it touched. We trudged through the forest, our boots crunching against the thick layer of snow. Dad carried the supplies in a backpack, and I carried a small bag with snacks and a thermos of hot chocolate. The further we walked, the quieter it became. Birds vanished. Even the occasional rustle of squirrels stopped. The forest felt like it was holding its breath, waiting. Dad said it was because of the storm coming from the north, but I didn't need an explanation to know something felt wrong. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, threatening. By late afternoon, we reached the lake. The ice stretched for what seemed like miles, pristine and white. Dad found a spot, dug a small hole, and began setting up the fishing gear. I sat nearby, shivering, staring at the tree line. It looked like a wall of black against the snow, each tree outlined in frost. That's when I noticed it, a man, far across the lake, standing perfectly still. He wasn't moving toward us, just watching. At first, I told myself it was a fisherman like Dad, someone else trying to enjoy the quiet. But something about the way he stood, stiff and unnatural, made my stomach knot. "Do you see him, Dad?" I asked, pointing. Dad didn't look. "It's probably nothing, champ. Perhaps just someone walking through the woods." But the man didn't move. He didn't walk. He just stayed there, staring. The sun was low, and his shadow stretched unnaturally long across the ice. I wanted to call out, but the wind stole my voice before it could leave my throat. I looked at Dad again. He was smiling at me, but I noticed he wasn't relaxed. He was tense, like he'd felt the same thing I did, but didn't want to admit it. We stayed for another hour. I kept sneaking glances at the man. Every time I looked, he seemed closer, though I hadn't seen him move. My teeth chattered, and the thermos of chocolate had long since gone cold. I was ready to leave, but Dad insisted on one last try at the ice hole. That's when it happened. A sharp cracking noise split the air. The ice around the hole trembled, and I realized with a sickening horror that the sound was not just the ice. It was footsteps, heavy, deliberate, crunching through the snow behind us. I turned quickly, heart hammering, and froze. There was no one there. Only the vast emptiness of the lake, untouched except for the footprints leading up to us, but none leading away. "Dad," I whispered, my voice trembling. He didn't respond at first. Then he stood, slowly scanning the tree line. His face went pale. "We need to go," he said. As we packed up, the wind picked up. The footprints reappeared, closer this time, circling us in a perfect semicircle, as if whatever was out there was hurting us. I stumbled over my own feet, trying to keep up with Dad. Then I saw it again, the man from across the lake. He wasn't walking toward us. He was gliding, smooth and fast, over the snow, keeping pace without breaking stride. "Run," Dad said, grabbing my arm. We bolted toward the trees, the snow now up to our knees, the wind pushing against us like a living wall. Behind us, the snow erupted as though something enormous was moving through it, faster than it should have been able to. I dared to glance over my shoulder and froze. The man was gone. In his place were dozens of dark shapes, thin and tall, moving impossibly fast through the snow, circling us. Their faces were pale, elongated but featureless, just hollow shadows where eyes should have been. I screamed, but the wind carried the sound away. Dad dragged me through the forest, using branches to guide us, trying to put the trees between us and whatever was following. But every time we stopped to catch our breath, the shadows were closer. Their presence made the air heavier, colder, almost solid. I could feel my body failing, my fingers and toes going numb despite the layers of clothes. My lips were blue, and I couldn't tell if I was crying or if it was just frostbite on my cheeks. We stumbled into a clearing, and I saw it. Our cabin. Relief hit me like a wave, but it was short-lived. The door was wide open. Snow had blown inside, covering the floor like a thick carpet, and the fire pit in the middle was cold. Dad cursed under his breath and ran in to check. No one was there. Nothing had been taken. But the shadows were outside, just at the tree line, watching. We stayed inside that night, huddled together, fire barely able to fend off the cold. Every so often, the shadows would step into the clearing when, tall and silent, as if to remind us they were there. We didn't sleep. I didn't speak. The only sound was the wind and the scraping of branches against the cabin walls. The next morning, the storm had passed. The snow was heavy, unbroken, except for the tracks around the cabin, circling endlessly, leading into the forest and never returning. Dad tried to explain it away to the authorities when we got to town. Maybe it was a lost traveler, maybe an animal, maybe hypothermia playing tricks on our minds. But he knew it wasn't. I knew it wasn't. Years later, when I returned to that forest as an adult, I found the footprints again, half buried under new snow. They weren't human, not by any measure. They stretched too far, moved too quickly, and circled in patterns that made no sense. Some led to the lake, others into the deep woods, and some disappeared in midair. I never saw the shadows again, but I could feel them, watching, waiting. That's how winter kills. Not with frostbite, not with hunger, but by patience, by letting you feel safe, alone, and then reminding you how small you are, how vulnerable. People in Black Hollow whisper about the forest, about the man on the ice, about the shapes that move faster than any human can. No one who ventures too far alone in winter ever comes back the same. Some don't come back at all. I never go there anymore, but every January, when the snow falls thick and the wind howls through the trees, I see them in my dreams, circling, silent and patient. Winter isn't quiet. It's waiting. Story the end. The winter of 1997 in northern Minnesota had been merciless. Snowstorms had battered the small town of Ely for weeks, leaving roads impassable and leaving residents huddled inside their homes for days at a time. The wind howled through the forest like a living thing, and temperatures regularly plunged below zero, frosting windows so thick that even the strongest lights inside the houses could barely pierce the blur of white outside. It was during one of these brutal storms that Mark Reynolds, a 28-year-old park ranger, found himself alone in the forest, farther from civilization than he had ever been. Mark had been on duty in the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, checking cabins and trails for stranded campers, and inspecting equipment left behind by adventurers who had underestimated the ferocity of the winter. He had driven his truck as far as the snowplows allowed, then strapped on his snowshoes and carried a pack of food, extra clothing, and a small portable heater. By late afternoon, he had reached a small ranger cabin near Lake Whittleson, its roof nearly buried in snow, the surrounding pines sagging under the weight of ice. The cabin was abandoned. He knew it had been used only in emergencies. Mark felt the first twinges of unease, but he brushed it aside. The isolation was part of the job. He made a fire in the small stone fireplace, the warm glow pushing back against the cold that seeped into his bones. Outside, the wind shrieked through the trees, making the entire forest sway like it was alive. As night fell, Mark ate a quick dinner and checked his map by lantern light. The storm had shifted unexpectedly, blowing in from the northwest with a ferocity he hadn't anticipated. Snow began to drift under the door, and the temperature inside the cabin started to plummet despite the fire. He decided he would need to stay the night. There was no way he could make it back in this weather. Around 10 p.m., he heard the first sound, a faint knocking on the cabin door. Mark froze. It was soft at first, hesitant, almost like someone testing the wood. He waited, listening. Nothing but the wind. He shook his head. He must be imagining it. Still, he reached for his flashlight, shining it toward the door. The beam revealed nothing, just the snow swirling in the dim lantern light. He returned to his chair, trying to ignore the sense of being watched. Minutes passed. Then it came again, knocking, this time louder and more deliberate. Mark set down the flashlight and crept toward the door, his hand on the cold metal handle. "Hello?" he called, his voice low but steady. "Who's out there?" Silence. Then a scraping sound, like claws dragged across wood. Mark's stomach tightened. He had been alone for hours. No other ranger or camper could have made it through this storm. Whoever, or whatever, was out there was moving in the snow with unnatural ease. Mark backed away, fumbling for his radio. He tried to call the main ranger station. Nothing. The storm had knocked out communication. Panic bubbled at the edges of his mind. He grabbed the old hunting rifle he always kept in the cabin and positioned himself near the fire, peering out the window. Through the frost, he thought he saw a figure. At first, it was just a shadow. Then it took shape. Tall, hunched, moving deliberately through the snow, but with a jerky, unnatural gait. Its head swiveled like it was studying him, its arms swinging in a way no human would. Mark's pulse raced. "No, this isn't real," he whispered. But the figure didn't disappear. It stopped at the edge of the tree line, then slowly moved toward the cabin. He aimed the rifle, but his hands were shaking so violently he could barely hold it steady. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows across the walls. Then the creature raised its head, or at least where its head should have been, and for a moment the frost-coated face was visible. Hollow eyes stared through the glass, glowing faintly in the firelight. Mark fired once. The shot cracked through the storm, but the figure didn't flinch. Then it stopped and vanished behind the trees as if swallowed by the snow. He tried to calm himself, telling himself it had to be an animal, maybe a moose or a deer, distorted by the shadows. But deep down, he knew it was wrong. The air in the cabin felt heavier, charged with a presence he could not explain. Hours passed in tense silence. The fire burned low, the wind howled, and Mark sat with the rifle across his lap, listening. Around 2 a.m., he heard it again, scratching at the cabin walls, circling him slowly. The sound was deliberate, intentional. He could feel it moving in the spaces just beyond the firelight. Mark's fear turned to determination. He knew he could not stay in the cabin forever. If the creature returned, it would not hesitate. He waited until dawn when the storm weakened enough to see through the snow. Carefully, he opened the cabin door. The forest was quiet, too quiet. The snow was pristine, undisturbed except for a single set of footprints leading from the tree line to the cabin and then disappearing back into the forest. They were enormous, at least twice the size of a man's, and the toes were elongated, clawed. He followed the tracks for a few hundred feet, but they vanished entirely, as if the creature had melted into the snow. Mark didn't dare go further. He returned to the cabin, shaken and exhausted. That night, in his own home, hundreds of miles away, Mark could not sleep. He kept seeing that figure in his mind, The hollow eyes, the unnatural movements, the way it had studied him like a predator studying prey. He told himself it was a hallucination, the product of isolation and exhaustion. But in the weeks that followed, he learned of other incidents. Hikers disappearing in the same area during winter storms. Cabin owners reporting strange shadows and noises outside their homes. Large, unidentifiable footprints found in snow where no human could have walked. Mark never returned to that part of the forest in the winter. But every year, when the first snow fell and the winds began to howl through the pines, he felt the same cold, suffocating presence. He would catch glimpses of a shadow at the edge of his vision, hear scraping in the night, faint knocking at doors that should be locked. He spoke to other rangers, old-timers who had spent decades in the Boundary Waters. Some dismissed his story as paranoia, others shared their own. They called it the Winter Stalker, a figure that only appeared during the harshest storms, always in the most isolated areas, always watching, always waiting. No one knew what it was, and no one who had seen it ever truly explained it. Mark knew one thing for certain. Winter in northern Minnesota was beautiful, serene, and deadly. And out there, in the snow and the wind, there were things that waited, things that were patient, relentless, and utterly inhuman. Years later, he would still drive past the forest in the winter and feel a chill crawl up his spine. He never saw the Winter Stalker again, but the memory was indelible. He had learned that some horrors were not in stories or legends. They were real, and they thrived in silence, in cold, and in snow. And when the wind howls through the pines and the snow drifts high against the trees, Mark sometimes swears he hears the faintest knock, deliberate and slow, just beyond the window. Story the end. It was the kind of winter that made people wonder if the sun had forgotten them entirely. In northern Maine, near the tiny town of Ashfield, the snow had been falling without pause for 5 days. The roads were impassable, and the wind howled through the bare trees like some ancient creature crying out in pain. Most residents had hunkered down in their homes, relying on generators and wood stoves to keep warm. But not everyone could stay indoors. Tom Whitaker, a local mail carrier, had been delivering in this area for over 20 years. He knew the back roads and forested trails better than anyone. Normally, a snowstorm of this magnitude would cancel mail delivery, but Tom's route included the more remote residents who relied on him weekly. It was late afternoon when he left the main road and veered onto a narrow, snow-choked lane that led deep into the woods. The sky was gray, the trees heavy with snow, branches snapping under their weight. Tom's truck creaked as he drove slowly, the tires struggling to maintain traction. Visibility was almost zero, the falling snow blurring the landscape into white indistinction. He passed the old Miller place, abandoned for years, its roof sagging, snow piling high against the walls. As he drove, he noticed something strange, a set of footprints, too large for a child, too small for a man, heading into the woods alongside the road. He frowned. There hadn't been anyone out this deep in the snow for days. He shook it off and continued, but the feeling of being watched began gnawing at him. Every crunch of snow under the tires sounded amplified. Every gust of wind sounded like whispering voices. By the time he reached the Lawson cabin, he was already tense. The cabin sat at the edge of a frozen pond, its chimney unused, the windows dark. He had delivered mail here for years. Normally, someone would meet him at the door, waving and smiling despite the cold. Today, nothing. Tom stepped out, the cold immediately biting through his gloves. He left the mail on the porch and noticed the door slightly ajar. Frowning, he pushed it open. Inside, the cabin was empty, but warm enough to suggest someone had been there recently. The floorboards were scratched, and he saw what looked like partial footprints in the snow tracked across the wooden floor. He froze. Then he noticed the writing, etched into the frost on the window pane. "Don't leave." His stomach tightened. At first he thought it was a prank, but the handwriting was jagged, uneven, like someone in distress had carved it. He scanned the cabin, calling out. "Hello? Is anyone here?" His voice echoed, but there was no answer. He felt foolish but uneasy, a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. He decided to check the perimeter. Outside, the footprints continued from the porch into the woods, that stopping at the tree line. He shone his flashlight, but the storm's heavy flakes distorted the beam. Then he saw it, a movement among the trees, pale, hunched, jerking oddly. He blinked. The figure seemed too thin, almost skeletal, moving in a way no human should. "Hey!" he shouted. No response. He took a cautious step forward, and the figure suddenly bolted, not running, but sliding across the snow like a shadow. Tom froze, the blood in his veins turning to ice. He fumbled for his radio, but found it dead. No signal. He was alone. The wind picked up, howling through the pines. He felt the cold sink deeper, freezing not just skin, but something inside him. He backed away, trying to reach his truck, but the forest seemed to shift. Paths he remembered were gone, replaced by a maze of trees and snow. Each step seemed heavier than the last. Panic began to claw at him. Hours passed, or was it minutes? Time felt suspended. The snowdrifts grew taller than his waist, and his boots sank with every step. He saw another cabin through the trees, smaller, partially collapsed. He ran toward it, desperate. Inside, the remnants of a fire had died to embers, and on the floor, more footprints. Smaller, childlike, circling the room in no discernible pattern. On the wall, carved deep into the wood, "It sees you." Tom's heart pounded. He knew he should leave, run back to the road, back to safety, but curiosity and the need to understand the horror pressed him forward. He left the cabin and heard it, dragging, something heavy, deliberate, moving through the snow outside, circling him. He froze, straining to see. Then, between the trees, he glimpsed figures, dozens of them, pale, gaunt, unblinking. They didn't run, didn't walk. They glided. Panic overtook him. He ran blindly, snow choking his lungs, branches slapping his face, the dragging sound following. He tripped over hidden roots, fell into a drift, snow filling his mouth and nostrils. When he got up, the first cabin was gone. The trees had shifted. The forest had become a labyrinth. Night fell, bringing total darkness. Tom had no choice but to keep moving, hoping for the main road, hoping to escape. But every turn, every clearing led him back to the same place. The pond, the frozen water reflecting the gray sky, and the figures standing along its edge. Watching. Waiting. He tried to scream, but the wind carried his voice away. The figures advanced, slowly, methodically, gliding over ice and snow. Tom stumbled backward, slipping onto the frozen pond. As he scrambled to his feet, he saw that the ice beneath the figures was cracked in strange patterns, like frozen veins. He ran, his mind barely functioning, heart hammering, lungs burning. When he finally broke through the tree line, he thought he was saved. But the town was silent. Snow covered everything, muffling sounds, swallowing the familiar roads. The houses were dark. No lights, no signs of life. It was as if the storm had erased the town. And in the distance, the dragging sound came again, closer now, mingled with whispers. Tom made it to his truck, collapsing behind the wheel, shivering, eyes darting to the forest. For a moment, he thought it was over. But then he saw movement, figures emerging from the tree line, gliding toward him. He tried the engine. Dead. Fumbling with the keys, he finally got it to turn, tires spinning in the snow, but the headlights revealed more figures surrounding the truck. The last thing Tom remembered before the truck finally lurched forward was their faces, hollow, frozen, eyes wide, staring. The dragging sound followed him out of the woods, fading slowly as he reached the main road. When he finally made it back to town, alive but shaken, the residents thought he was hallucinating. There had been no missing persons reported, no signs of the forest having claimed anyone. Yet Tom knew what he had seen, what had followed him from the depths of winter. Weeks later, the northern roads were still treacherous, but people began disappearing. Hunters, hikers, and mail carriers alike vanished without a trace. Only their tracks in the snow remained, and the strange messages scratched into the frost of cabins, always warning, "Don't leave." Tom never spoke of the full story. Even now, sitting by the fire in his small home, he feels it. The forest doesn't forget. The winter doesn't forgive, and every time he hears the wind howl, carrying whispers through the trees, he knows they are watching, waiting, and someday they will come for him again. Story the end. The storm hit just as the sun dipped below the horizon, turning the small Minnesota town of Ashwood into a frozen wasteland. Snow fell so thickly that streetlights flickered against the whiteout, and the few cars on the road crept along like cautious animals. Mark Reynolds had been driving for hours, delivering propane tanks to cabins scattered across the outskirts of town. Normally, he enjoyed the solitude of winter nights, the way the silence in the woods felt almost sacred. But tonight, something about the storm felt different, darker, heavier. like the air itself was warning him to turn back. Mark's truck struggled through the snow-packed roads. His tires slipped on ice hidden beneath the fresh snowfall, and the wind whistled through the small gaps in his truck's cab. He glanced at the clock. 8:43 p.m. Only a few more stops, he told himself. Just a few more. But the roads ahead twisted deeper into the forest, the trees closing in like the walls of a tunnel. About 20 miles from town, near the edge of Lake Hollow, he saw a figure standing in the middle of the road. At first, he thought it was a stranded traveler. The figure was dressed in heavy winter clothes, hood pulled tight, and didn't move even as the truck slowed to a stop. "Hey!" Mark called, rolling down the window despite the cold. "Do you need help?" The figure didn't answer. It didn't flinch. Mark felt a chill beyond the cold bite of the wind. Something was wrong. Too still. Too quiet. He hesitated, debating whether to stop. His instincts screamed at him to drive on, but his human sense of obligation won. Before he could step out, the figure moved, or rather glided. Not walking, not running, but sliding forward in a way that made no sense. Mark slammed the gas, tires spinning on the ice, and drove past the figure. When he glanced in the rearview mirror, the person, or thing, was gone. No footprints in the snow. No signs of anyone being there at all. He shook his head, telling himself it had been a trick of the storm, a shadow, maybe a hallucination from fatigue. But as he drove deeper into the woods, the feeling of being watched grew heavier. He tried focusing on the road, the bright beam of his headlights cutting a path through the snow, but his peripheral vision caught movement, flashes of dark shapes between the trees. Finally, he reached the Johnson cabin, a small, isolated structure by the frozen lake. The snow had piled high against the door, and the wind rattled the walls. Mark set down the propane tanks and went to knock, but the door opened before his fist hit the wood. Inside, the cabin was empty, but a single chair had been overturned, as if someone had left in a hurry. "Hello?" he called, his voice shaking slightly. No answer. He checked the rooms one by one, finding nothing. The fireplace had ash from a long-dead fire, and the windows were frosted over. He felt a prickle on the back of his neck, the kind that comes right before something terrible happens. As he was leaving, he heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from just outside near the tree line. Mark froze. The growl didn't sound like any animal he knew. It was deep, resonant, deliberate, and it carried an almost intelligent weight. He shone his flashlight into the snow, the beam cutting through the swirling storm, but there was nothing except the faint impression of footprints in the snow. They were huge, unnaturally so, and the shape was wrong, elongated, clawed, and following a path that circled the cabin. Mark didn't wait to investigate. He jumped into his truck, doors locked, heart pounding, and drove back toward the main road. But the feeling of being followed never left. Every time he glanced into the woods, he thought he saw movement, something tall, hunched, and impossibly fast, darting between trees, disappearing and reappearing at impossible angles. By the time he reached town, his hands were numb and his breath came in shallow gasps. He told the dispatcher at the gas station about the strange figure, the footprints, the growl, but the man behind the counter just laughed nervously. "Winter's bad this year," he said. "Storms mess with your mind." Mark tried to convince himself it was just the storm, but the feeling of being watched didn't fade. Over the next few days, he drove cautiously, avoiding the back roads, keeping the lights on in his house at night. But every winter, when snow falls heavily in Ashwood, he notices it. Footprints in places where no one could have walked, shadows that vanish when you look directly at them, and that low growl carried on the wind when the night is still. A few weeks later, news came of a snowmobiler found frozen near Lake Hollow. The tracks around him formed a perfect circle, too large for a human or an animal. Another family, stranded in their cabin during a blizzard, disappeared entirely. Their footprints stopped abruptly at the edge of the forest, leading nowhere. The stories were hushed, buried in the local papers, dismissed by authorities. But the residents of Ashwood whispered the same thing. Something hunts during the storms, waiting for those who stray too far. Mark never returned to the back roads, never ventures out during heavy snow. He sleeps with the windows locked, but sometimes when the wind howls just right, he hears it. The growl, deliberate and slow, circling the house. And he knows that the figure in the storm is patient. It waits for the foolish, the unprepared, and the unlucky. Every winter, as the first snow falls and the town retreats indoors, Mark feels the unease creeping back. Every time a storm isolates the roads, he remembers the hollow, unblinking eyes, the clawed footprints in the snow, and the guttural growl that seems to echo from everywhere and nowhere at once. He tells himself to stay calm, to rationalize, to ignore the fear. But he knows the truth. The storm doesn't just cover the world in snow, it hides the watcher. The creature waits, circling, patient and inevitable. And every winter, it claims new victims. Mark doesn't drive in storms anymore. He never ventures out after dark. He never takes the back roads. And even now, sitting safely in his home, he can feel it watching from the edge of the woods, just beyond the headlights, waiting for the next traveler foolish enough to challenge the winter night. Story, the end. The snow had started falling in earnest by mid-afternoon, a steady, thick blanket that quickly coated the small town of Ashcroft, Montana. By the time the sun disappeared behind the jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains, streets were nearly impassable and the wind was whipping drifts across the rooftops. It was the kind of winter storm that could strand a person for days, and for most of the town, that was exactly what happened. Carla Myers, a reporter for the local newspaper, had driven up from Missoula that morning to cover a feature on the town's history. She had planned to leave by evening, but the storm closed in faster than anyone anticipated. By dusk, she was trapped, her rental car buried in a drift outside the only motel in town. She went inside, paid for a room, and settled by the small heater, watching the snow lash the windows like needles. Across the hall, a man named Sam Burke was staying as well. He was a geologist, passing through to inspect the mountain's rock formations for a state study. The storm had caught him off guard, too, and now the two of them shared an uneasy camaraderie, both trapped by circumstances beyond their control. The first night was quiet, save for the wind rattling the window panes. Carla tried to read, Sam kept notes in his journal, but there was a tension in the air neither could shake. Something about Ashcroft felt different. Older, colder, as if the mountains themselves were watching. Around 2 a.m, Carla was awakened by a tapping at her window. She froze, straining to hear over the howl of the wind. Tap, tap, tap. Not random, deliberate. Her heart raced. She got up, peered through the frosted glass, but all she could see was the swirling white of the storm. Just the wind, she whispered to herself, though the sound was nothing like wind. It was rhythmic, like fingers drumming. She returned to bed, but sleep did not come. The tapping returned periodically through the night, growing louder, more insistent, and then a whisper, so faint she almost imagined it. Help. By morning, she found that her door was slightly ajar. She was certain she had locked it. Sam, seeing her agitation, insisted it was nothing, a draft, maybe, or sleepwalking. But when they looked outside, something odd caught their eyes. Footprints in the snow. Not human boots, but bare feet. Small, thin, tracking across the ice-crusted parking lot, then vanishing toward the forest at the edge of town. I didn't see anyone out there, Carla said, shivering. They weren't human. Sam frowned. Let's not jump to conclusions. Could be kids, local pranksters, someone caught in the storm. But as the day went on, strange occurrences multiplied. Items in Carla's room moved slightly, chairs shifted, a towel disappeared from the bathroom only to reappear on the floor. The motel felt alive with subtle disturbances, each one setting their nerves on edge. On the second night, the knocking escalated, not just at Carla's window this time, but all along the hallway. Hollow, echoing taps coming from behind walls and beneath floors, and the whispering had grown, faint but audible now, like voices carried through the storm. Help! Help us! Please! Neither Carla nor Sam slept. They barricaded the doors with furniture, and Carla recorded the noises with her phone. In the early hours, the recordings caught something impossible. Faint, high-pitched moans, layered with something that sounded like a child crying, yet distorted, almost inhuman. Desperate for answers, they ventured out the next morning, carefully shoveling their way through the snow toward the forest at the edge of town. There, they discovered a frozen creek, its surface thick with ice. Scattered across the bank were more footprints, bare, small, often ending abruptly as if whoever made them had simply vanished. Some impressions were shallow, some deeply pressed, as though heavy weight had fallen and been dragged away. They're trying to get back, Carla murmured, staring at the prints. Or maybe they never left. Sam felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. "I've worked in caves and permafrost, even in remote Alaska," he said. "I've never seen tracks like these. Nothing natural explains this." As night fell again, the motel became a cage. Windows rattled violently, doors creaked and moaned, and the whispers persisted. Carla swore she saw figures in the snow outside, pale, thin shapes moving just beyond the headlights of passing cars, if any passed at all. One figure crouched at the edge of the forest, watching, waiting. Its eyes were black, hollow, unblinking. By the fourth night, fear had fully taken hold. The two decided to leave, despite the storm. They bundled themselves in every layer they had, packed into Sam's truck, and began the treacherous drive down the mountain road. Snow was falling in blinding sheets and visibility was near zero. Halfway down, the truck skidded on ice. Carla glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. On the road behind them was a figure, barefoot, small, moving impossibly fast despite the snow. Its arms were thin, dragging slightly as though it wasn't fully grounded. Sam slammed the wheel, trying to keep control. By the time they regained traction, the figure had vanished, but the memory of its hollow gaze remained. They reached a town miles away, shaken, exhausted. Carla called her editor and the sheriff. Both were skeptical until she described the footprints, the whispers, and the storm's behavior. The sheriff went pale. "That area," he said, voice low, "people avoid it after December. Not just because of storms. Too many disappearances, something in the forest, something that preys on travelers. We don't know what it is, but we know it's old. Really old." Carla and Sam never returned to Ashcroft, but Carla's dreams were haunted for years after. The tapping, the whispers, the barefoot figures moving silently through snow. Eric, the sheriff's nephew, who had grown up in town, told her years later that locals still avoid the roads near that forest. That the cold itself seems alive, remembers, and watches. Carla eventually published her story, cautiously. She left out the most disturbing parts, the faces of the figures in the snow, the way the whispers sounded almost human, but not quite. People thought she exaggerated, but she knew. She knew that the storm had been more than a storm, that something had waited for them in the snow, patient, silent, and eternal. Sometimes, years later, Carla would drive past the mountains in spring, when the snow had melted and the forest seemed calm. She swore she could still see movement at the edge of the tree line, and sometimes, late at night, she would hear the faintest tapping on her window, bare, deliberate, demanding attention, and she knew, without doubt, that winter in that forest did not forgive. Story. The end. The snow came early that year in northern Minnesota, a heavy, relentless white that blanketed everything in sight. By the third day, the small town of Eagles Hollow was nearly buried. The roads were slick and unplowed, cars abandoned in ditches, and the forests surrounding the town pressed close to the edges of the houses, dark and silent under the snow. It was the kind of winter that made people stay inside, huddled by fireplaces, and whisper about the old stories of the woods, stories that told of people who vanished into the blizzard, never to be seen again. Megan Carter had lived in Eagles Hollow all her life. She knew every twist of the frozen roads, every hidden hollow in the nearby pine forest. That familiarity gave her confidence, or so she thought. That December evening, she was driving home from a friend's house, her old Jeep struggling through the deep snow. The sky was dark, the wind whipping through the trees with a sound like screaming. Visibility was near zero, and the heater struggled to keep the windshield from fogging over. Megan's mind kept drifting to the stories her grandmother used to tell about the White Watchers, mysterious figures that roamed the forest during blizzards, stealing anyone foolish enough to wander alone. She laughed to herself, trying to shake off the fear, but deep down, a knot of unease tightened in her stomach. As she turned onto the road leading to her house, the Jeep hit a patch of ice and fishtailed, sliding off the side of the road into the snowbank. Heart racing, Megan tried to get it out, but the tires spun helplessly, throwing snow over the hood. She cursed under her breath and grabbed her phone to call for help. But there was no signal. Of course. The storm had knocked out the towers, just like it always did. She was alone, stranded, and the snow kept falling, distinct and piling over the tracks behind her until the Jeep was nearly invisible. Megan decided she had no choice but to walk. She grabbed a flashlight, wrapped herself in her coat, and trudged through the snow, following what she thought was the path to her house. The wind bit at her face, and the cold seeped into her bones. Every sound was amplified: the groan of the trees under the weight of snow, the distant cracking of ice on the frozen river, and something else. Faint but there. A crunching sound, deliberate and slow, coming from behind her. She froze, listening. The wind drowned it out, but her gut told her it was close, following her. She quickened her pace, calling out into the storm. "Hello? Is someone there?" Her voice vanished instantly, swallowed by the howling wind. The crunching continued, matching her steps, never faster, never slower, just a steady rhythm keeping pace with her heartbeat. Megan's mind raced. It had to be someone else, stranded like her, maybe looking for shelter. She told herself that, even as fear gnawed at her. The forest loomed ahead, the trees tall and skeletal, black against the white expanse. Megan's house was on the far side, just beyond the tree line. As she entered the woods, the crunching stopped. Silence fell so heavy that the only sound she could hear was her own breathing and the snow crunching under her boots. Then she saw them, footprints in the snow, human, but wrong. Too wide, too long, and there were dozens of them, overlapping, leading in every direction. They weren't recent. The snow had already started to cover them, but it was clear someone, or something, had passed through here, and it hadn't walked straight. Megan's flashlight flickered as she followed the trail, trying to keep her bearings. Then she heard it, a low whispering, barely audible over the wind. She stopped, straining to hear. The voices were incoherent at first, like 1,000 murmurs layered over each other. Then a single phrase became clear. "Don't look back." Her heart pounded. She spun, shining the flashlight in every direction, but the trees were empty. The wind was still, unnaturally so, and for a moment she thought she imagined it. Then she saw movement. Just beyond the trees, a figure stood, pale against the dark trunks. She blinked, and it was gone. She shook her head, telling herself it was a trick of the storm and shadows playing on snow and branches. But then she felt it. A presence, cold and heavy, pressing in from all sides, as if the forest itself was watching her. The whispering returned, louder this time, inside her head, urging her to keep moving, to run. Megan broke into a full run, snow spraying in every direction, trying to keep her fear under control. Her flashlight bobbed wildly, and for a second she saw more figures, tall, thin, hunched, standing among the trees, motionless, their faces pale and featureless. She tripped over a root and fell, the snow instantly soaking her gloves and coat. When she scrambled to her feet, the figures were gone, but the whispering persisted, now frantic, chaotic, overlapping with other voices, some mocking, some pleading. The forest seemed endless, but Megan forced herself forward, relying on memory to guide her toward the edge. Her legs burned, her breath came in ragged gasps, and every step felt like it took her deeper into some other world. Finally, she saw a faint light ahead. Her house. Relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. As she approached the yard, she saw footprints leading from the edge of the forest to her front door. Dozens of them, overlapping in every direction. Some were small, some enormous, none of them entirely human. She fumbled with her keys, shaking so badly she nearly dropped them. The front door creaked open, and she stumbled inside, slamming it behind her and locking it. The house was warm, but it didn't feel safe. Shadows clung to the corners, stretching unnaturally, moving slightly when she wasn't looking. The whispering followed her inside, soft at first, then growing louder, filling every room, repeating over and over. "You shouldn't be here. You can't leave. They are waiting." Megan tried to call for help again, but her phone was dead. The lights flickered and went out, leaving her in complete darkness. She could hear the wind rattling the windows, the snow piling against the walls, and something scratching at the door, slow and deliberate. She backed away, clutching a kitchen knife, heart hammering, unable to move. The scratching grew louder, closer, then stopped. For hours she stayed in the living room, flashlight in hand, listening. The storm outside raged, but now it felt secondary, as if it had always been a backdrop for what was watching her. Occasionally she thought she saw shadows moving behind the frosted windows, figures that didn't belong. She wanted to run, to drive anywhere, but she knew the roads were impassable. And somehow she knew that leaving the house would mean stepping into them, whatever they were. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving Eagles Hollow eerily silent. Megan looked outside cautiously. The snow was untouched, pristine, except for the footprints leading from the forest to her house, and none leading back. She thought she saw shapes moving between the trees just at the edge of visibility, but when she blinked, they were gone. She realized with a sinking feeling that the watchers weren't gone. They were patient, waiting. Days later, Megan tried to return to normal life. She went to work, she saw friends, she laughed, but she never spoke of what happened. No one would believe her. And she noticed the signs everywhere. Shadows in the corner of her vision, footprints in the snow around the house that she hadn't seen form, and whispering, faint but unmistakable when she was alone at night. Winter after winter, the storm returned, always heavier than it had any right to be. And every time she could feel the presence in the forest, just beyond the reach of her flashlight, waiting, watching. And she knew that someday it would come closer and she would have no place to hide. Even now, years later, when Megan drives through northern Minnesota in December, she notices the forests lining the roads. They are quiet, too quiet, snow piled high and silent, and sometimes just at the edge of her vision she sees movement, pale figures, hunched and still, watching from the trees, always watching, always waiting for the next person foolish enough to wander too far in the winter. Story the end.